Well, today's Global Awareness Lecture, sponsored by the Kennedy Center, is with Professor Earl Fry. Is the United States a declining superpower? Professor Fry recently returned to the United States after directing BYU's academic study abroad program in Paris. Professor Fry previously has served as a Fulbright lecturer at the Sorbonne, as Director of International Education and Canadian Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, and as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, as well as Special Assistant in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, part of the Executive Office of the President of the United States. During his time period at USTR, Professor Fry specialized in international investment issues and in U.S.-Canadian trade issues. He has numerous publications, including The Decline of the American Superpower in The Forum, a Journal of Applied Research in Contemporary Politics, 2007, and The Long Road to Free Trade and Policy Options, 2007. In addition, he's co-author of Urban Economic Response to Internationalization with Edward Elgar in 2005, and author or co-author of America the Vincible, U.S. Foreign Policy for the 21st Century, which I know many students and faculty have used. He also has authored North American Economic Integration Policy Options with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Over the past years, he's made numerous presentations on international and regional trade, investment, economic development, and foreign policy issues to business and academic audiences in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and North America. Professor Fry coordinates and hosts the Asel and Maydell Palmer annual lecture at BYU. For those of you who are interested in Canada and Canadian studies, and I know there are many, Professor Fry is one of those key faculty on campus, and has done so much to further Canadian studies that we're always grateful to hear from him. When he offered this presentation for us, I knew it would be something that would be of value. It was scheduled with a little bit of late notice, so I'm glad to see such a good crowd. But also, I'm certain that there are plenty of people in cyberspace who will be interested in watching and learning from the research that Professor Fry has done. So today, speaking on Is the United States a Declining Superpower, please join me in welcoming Professor Earl Fry.
I appreciate that kind introduction. Can you hear me okay in the back? Are we doing all right? Yesterday, President Obama used the term gathering clouds and raging storms. And we are in for a difficult rough patch for the time being. If we would have taken a survey on Monday, we would have found that over 80% of Americans would say that the United States is headed in the wrong direction. We'd find half of the Americans would say that they're worse off today financially than they were 5 years ago. And we'd have, perhaps even more disturbingly, have half of the Americans say that they feel that their children, when they become adults, will have a lower standard of living than the parents have had. So this is a rough patch that we're going through. Eventually we'll get through it, but the question today is the United States a declining superpower? I'm going to argue it is in relative terms. But that does not mean that our standard of living will not improve over time. And I'll try to explain that as we go on. And perhaps this relative terms, I can show it through this example. Many of you are descended from Mormon pioneers, and you've read some of the journals and diaries. And you know through that some of the moving experiences, young children passing away, or an infant not surviving at birth. And this is something that was fairly typical in the United States as a whole. Notice here that a person born in the U.S. in 1800 had an average lifespan of 35 years. Now, if you happen to live beyond infancy, you probably live longer than that, but that was the average when you take into account the infant mortality rate. And then a person born in 1900, 47 years. So there's a difference of 12 years in a century. But notice that a person born in 2006 is expected to live an average of 78 years. Tremendous, tremendous improvement. So in that respect, we're very, very optimistic. On the other hand, if you look at the lifespan of the United States versus the rest of the world, according to the CIA's World Factbook, we only rank 46 in the world in terms of longevity, just behind Cyprus. Well, we can do better. Another example would be the infant mortality rate. In 1900, it was about 100 deaths per 1,000 live births. In 2006, it was down to 6.7. That is a tremendous achievement. headed definitely in the right direction. But comparatively, in terms of what's going on in the rest of the world, we ranked 42nd in the world. And infant mortality rates right behind Cuba. We can do better. I don't think there's any doubt that the 20th century was the American century. Henry Luce used this term in the early 1940s. There's hardly a person that would disagree with that the 20th century was the American century. We emerged from World War II with our territory intact. We accounted at that time for about half of the world's total production of goods and services. We possessed the most imposing military force and had a monopoly on atomic weapons. In fact, arguably, we might say the U.S. may have been the most powerful nation ever to have existed in about 1945. Some would argue, well, you have to go back to Rome. Some would say, without exception, the U.S. definitely the dominant nation in the world. And even during the Cold War period, 1947, 1989, we talk about two superpowers. And certainly the Soviet Union was a superpower in strategic terms. It wasn't in economic terms. Far smaller economy than the American economy. And then we get to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Empire itself. And then by 1991, we see the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. So we're left then with one superpower, the United States of America. And indeed, it would be a sole superpower which would eventually be referred to in political science jargon as a unipolar hegemon. Indeed, the Foreign Affairs Minister of France in 1999 would refer to the United States as a hyperpower, beyond a superpower, dominant in a variety of areas, not just military, but also political and diplomatic and economic and financial and cultural, as well as media. A hyperpower, even beyond being a superpower. Well, if we look at things at the end of this past year, the U.S., with about 4.5% of the world's population, accounted for almost 25% of the world's GDP. And you take the World Bank figures for that period of time, and roughly 25% of everything being produced in the world. And that's fairly impressive, is it not? A nation with a relatively small percentage of the overall population, accounting for roughly a quarter of everything produced on the planet. In addition, you'll notice that we're actually going to continue to grow as a population. We have about 305 million people in our country today. By 2050, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that we will, or at least projects that we'll be up to 420 million people in the United States. Roughly 40 years from now, we will have increased our population by well over 100 million. At a time when a lot of other nations will actually see a decrease in population. As you'll notice here, Russia is expected to lose 22% of its population by the time we get to 2050, going down to 111 million people. Japan will go down from roughly 127 million to 100 million people. Germany from 82 to 71, and Italy from 58 million to 52 million. Even China's population may begin to decline by the 2030s. So that you would think, hey, well, we're producing so much of what the world is producing. We are going to continue to grow as a population when some other major nations will actually decline in population. We should be in good stead. Well, let's take a look at that. I believe that by 2040, probably no nation will be referred to as a superpower. Now, we may talk about major powers, but I think that once you get beyond one or two, you really can't talk about a superpower. Then you're getting into the range of major powers. And I don't think that the 21st century will be known as as the American century. I just don't see it stacking up that way. Obviously, I could be wrong. I won't be around to have people criticize me for it if it is called the American century. But probably not. And there are three fundamental factors that will contribute to the end of the superpower era as we now know it. One will be the demands of globalization. Second will be the rise of competitor nations or groups of nations. And thirdly will be the failure of the United States to confront adequately major problems at home. Indeed, President Obama made reference to that yesterday when he said our collective failure to make hard choices. Our collective failure to make hard choices. So I think in 2040, the United States will remain the number one power in the world in military terms, but will account for a much smaller proportion of global production and have a somewhat diminished voice in international affairs. Let me explain again these factors that will lead to a relative decline of the United States as a superpower. First one is globalization. And this means a growing interconnectedness, a growing interdependency among nations and societies. Many problems will be beyond the capacity of individual nation states to solve unilaterally. And it will put a premium on multilateral cooperation across national boundaries. It will make it much more difficult to act unilaterally or to find solutions that are unilateral. Case in point, several years ago I visited Beijing. And they have large avenues and boulevards like we find in Salt Lake City. And there were relatively few cars on those huge boulevards. A few years ago, I visited Mumbai, then known as Bombay, and then went out to Goa. And again, traffic in Mumbai, but mostly small vehicles, particularly small motorcycles. Well, if we go back there today, we'll find a difference. In fact, what we found over the past few years is that about 2 billion inhabitants of the earth, among the 6.7 billion, have joined the market system. Basically said, we believe in the market system. We believe in capitalism, even though they might cloud it in a different ideology. And particularly, we look at the changes in China over the past 30 years, and in India in a shorter time span. So what you see now, if you go to Beijing, are traffic jams. More and more people wanting what we have. Basically saying, we want cars like you have. We want air conditioning in our offices. We want air conditioning in our homes like you have in the United States. Well, this is great to a certain extent, is it not? But on the other hand, it does mean there's going to be more and more pollution. That more and more people rely on gas combustion engines to run their vehicles. As they use more air conditioning, we're going to see more of a problem in terms of solving our environmental problems. And maybe we'll do everything we need to in the United States. Maybe we'll turn to hybrid cars. And we're going to really make all of our buildings energy efficient. But unless other nations join with us, we're still going to see a deterioration in some of the environmental areas, such as climate change. It really shows a premium being placed on multinational cooperation, nations working together to solve the problems that cannot be solved single-handedly by any one individual nation. That, again, is a sign of globalization. And again, we're going to see more technological change than ever before, accelerating the pace of globalization. Indeed, I would argue that looking at my adult years, let's say roughly from the 60s on, and looking what your adult years will be, from now until, let's say, 2050, I will almost be back comparatively in the age of the covered wagons. You are going to experience so much more change, so much more rapidly, that will impact upon your daily lives. That my period of change, which was dramatic, the greatest in human history, will compare to be rather insignificant in terms of the change that you are going to go through. And we're going to go through more and more what we call creative destruction. It's a term that comes from Schumpeter way back in the 1940s. And where we're going to simultaneously be creating businesses, and then businesses will go out of business, and we're going to create jobs, and we're going to see jobs in. For example, you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics for 2007, you'll find that we created 30 million new jobs in the private sector. But we lost over 29 million. Over 29 million Americans lost their jobs. That's creative destruction. You look at how well Silicon Valley has done over the past few decades, but compare it to a Detroit, which in 1950 was the fourth largest city in the United States, today is the 11th largest city, and has lost half of its population since 1950, in part because of people moving to suburbs, but also in part because it's no longer as economically competitive as it once was. This is creative destruction at work, and you will be part and parcel of this creative destruction as we go through the next few decades. This sort of shows you, gives you a very quick indication of how things occurring internationally may impact you at the local level, including living in Provo, Utah. We have diseases, about a half dozen that we never heard about a half dozen years ago. As far as we know, they did not have their origins in the United States, but they're having a significant impact upon American society today, including HIV and AIDS and hepatitis C and other things that we really hadn't identified not that long ago, occurred outside the nation, but have certainly had an impact on us. Or if we look at energy, where we get 60% of our oil from outside sources. We can't run our transportation system, we can't run our factories without foreigners providing a good share of the oil that we use in our society. And in many, many ways, you can see how in all these dimensions we have become so much more interrelated, interlinked, interconnected, interdependent with the rest of the world. And decisions made outside our boundaries or events which occur may indeed have a significant impact on our life here in Utah Valley. So that's globalization. The second factor will be the rise of global competitors. China stands out. By 2050, China will have the largest economy in the world. In fact, it may have the largest economy by, within the next 20 years. It will be a larger economy than the U.S. India is getting on its feet, and with its billion people, would continue to grow and may indeed become a competitor down the line. The European Union is a group of nations, 27 nations, 500 million people. It will continue to grow, and it will be a factor in international relations as we move to 2040 or so. ASEAN, which is a Southeast Asian free trade area, will probably become much more important. Japan, even with a dwindling population, will still be a major economic player. Russia, depending on how well oil and natural gas is doing, how well Russia does to diversify its economy, may still be a significant player. Brazil is up and coming, sitting with large cash reserves now, and finally discovering oil. It may become a significant power as we move to 2040, or maybe even in Indonesia. So again, as we look at the U.S. in 2040, relatively, as I'm arguing, may not be considered as a superpower, and there will be other nations that will have, or groups of nations that will have a greater voice as time goes on. We'll still have a major voice, but may not be viewed as a superpower in 2040 because of the rise of these global competitors, either individual nation states or groups of nations working together. And the third factor is the one that President Obama was really touching on yesterday, that we've got to take care of our problems at home. And we haven't been willing to make hard decisions. And because of the reticence to make hard decisions, it may diminish our influence around the world. And let me just give you a laundry list of some of the problems that we're facing. For example, record federal government debt. It actually will double between 2000 and 2010. It's amazing that we'll actually double the cumulative government debt in just a decade. Indeed, we're looking at a $1 trillion deficit just this year in 12 months. To put that in perspective, obviously I'm talking about nominal dollars today, but to put that in perspective, that $1 trillion deficit is greater than the accumulated debt of the United States government from the time that George Washington became president through the first year of Ronald Reagan's administration. And we will match that in a 12-month period, in nominal dollars. Of course, there's a difference there. But it's almost staggering how much debt the federal government is incurring. And indeed, President Obama has warned that we might have a series of $1 trillion deficits as our debt continues to go up. And indeed, in times which were mostly good times for us in terms of economic growth, Washington has only been able to balance his budget 5 times since 1961. That is a sign of a major problem. The second would be that we're the world's largest external debtor country. That means that we owe more to foreigners than they owe to us. Indeed, we owe much more to foreigners than any other nation owes to foreigners. We're getting up to about a $3 trillion external debt. And indeed, just during the years from 2000 to 2008, in terms of our deficit in goods and services, what we export versus what we import, we had a deficit just during that period of time of $5 trillion. we're not even close to seeing a year when we may be able to have a balance in terms of our trade in goods and services. Thirdly is it's not just a problem of Washington. I went back and read President Hinckley's address from about 1997 when he said, you know something, we're going too much in debt. We're too much in debt in terms of the mortgages that we're carrying. And he gave us figures in terms of percentage of GDP. And we're going too much in debt in terms of our credit cards. This is back in 1997. Well, President Hinckley, looking down today, would be a little bit miffed, I think, because looking at the percentages back then versus the percentages now of our debt, mortgage debt, credit card debt, there's no comparison. It's much worse today. Much worse today than it was in 1997. We haven't heeded his message, at least not as a nation. I hope that we as members of the church have heeded his message to live modestly and within our means. But household debt in the United States has doubled just in the past 7 years to about $14 trillion. And a fair number of Americans were using the growing equity in their homes as their ATM machines. They would just go out and borrow and borrow and borrow on the equity, believing that their equity would continue to go up forever. And now we are facing the problem of that's not happening. And I'll get back to that in a moment. The fourth major problem is entitlement explosion. We're roughly going to have a quarter of our population, the so-called baby boomers, begin to retire very soon. Some could already retire on a proportion of Social Security, but very soon, within the next couple of years, they'll begin to retire with full Social Security benefits and full Medicare benefits. And we're also heading towards a time when we're going to have proportionally fewer workers than retirees. Now, remember, it was Franklin Roosevelt that introduced Social Security system. But it was sort of, how should I put it? There was a hook on it. Basically said, you're going to be paying into your Social Security fund now, and we're going to pay you when you retire. But you need to be 65. And at that time, the average American was not living to be 65 years old. So basically, they were paying into a system, but many of them would not receive the benefits. And at that time, we had about 16 workers for every retiree. Now we're getting down to the range of about 3 workers per retiree. And we're going to head towards almost 2 workers per retiree. So if we haven't faced up to this entitlement explosion, and we're going to be relying on fewer workers in proportion to the number of people retired, you can see we have a big problem. We have a big problem. And that means that we're putting more and more and more of a burden upon you as you will be entering the workforce over the next few years. And quite frankly, that is not fair. That is not fair, but that is a problem that we will be facing very, very soon. Another one is our out-of-control healthcare spending. Now, you can get the best healthcare in the world in the United States. No doubt about that. The problem is we're spending over 16% of our GDP on healthcare. No other major nation spends even 12%. But they cover all of our people, of their people. We have over 45 million Americans without any health insurance at all. And that includes roughly 7 to 8 million children. So every other Western nation covers all of its people in terms of health care. And they spend a whole lot less than we do, even though we have over 45 million without any insurance at all. And on a per capita basis, the United States compared to the rest of the Western world, we spend twice as much as they spend on health care. We've got to get a handle on that, otherwise we're really into a competitiveness bind. What do I mean by that? Well, take the big 3, which are struggling, in Detroit. They transferred more of their production to Ontario in Canada than they have in Michigan. They actually produce more cars in Ontario than Michigan. Why? Well, on average, they can save $1,000 per car just in terms of the healthcare savings in Canada versus the healthcare savings in Michigan. It's a competitiveness issue. As we spend more and more on healthcare, it means that there's going to be more and more business activity go offshore to other countries. It's a competitiveness issue, and we have to get a handle on it. The other one is education deficit. We've always been known for our public school system. We were the first to install that. For most of the past several decades, we've been number 1 in terms of graduation rates. No longer. We've fallen to 16th or 17th in the world. We literally lose about 1 million young people a year dropping out of school before they graduate. And we have about 1/3 of our graduates who actually have a degree from high school that are ill-prepared to go on to college or to basically take on very challenging jobs. If you look at comparative tests, as we take our young people, compare them to nations in what we call the OECD, as a group of major, mostly Western nations, our fourth graders tend to do pretty well in comparative tests. Our eighth graders do not do nearly as well. They fall below the median. And then our 12th graders do the worst of all. So as time goes on, we fall further behind other nations. In the 21st century, if we look at natural resources, there's absolutely no doubt about it, the most important natural resource is the human resource, and it's brain power. And we are not competing the way we used to compete in terms of public education. We need to do a much better job K through 12 than we're doing now if we are going to be competitive over the next few decades. Infrastructure deficiencies, we know about the problems we have with our bridges and our ports and our railways and our highway system and our airports. We haven't built a major airport since Denver, going back quite a number of years now. We're falling behind in terms of the information highway. It used to be that we led the world in terms of internet connection, and we led the world in terms of the speed of internet connection. We've now fallen way behind. We're not even in the top 10 any longer. And, the thing is, we can be complacent and think we're doing okay, we're going along, but in actuality, we're not, comparatively, relatively. We need to do a much better job. We have problems within the Beltway, and of course what I mean by that is Washington, D.C. Too often we have had special interests take precedence over the general interests. President Obama mentioned that yesterday. In fact, his quote was, "Our time of standing pat, protecting narrow interests, and putting off unpleasant decisions, that time has surely passed." But that's what we've been doing. For example, we have a tax code which is over 40,000 pages long. And we hear about the problem with earmarks. John McCain was very good about that, where members of Congress earmark projects for the local district. This is what we call pork. And there's a fair amount of that. But if you look at all the things that are placed in the tax code, benefits to certain corporations, or whatever it might be, the earmarks actually pale in comparison to how much money is being lost by the special tax breaks that are there. We've got to move away from the special interest to the general interest. We've got to have campaign finance reform so that there's not IOUs that members of Congress are expected to pay to those that give big contributions. We have too much partisanship. We have too many Republicans and Democrats going to Congress. We have too many politicians going to Congress. We don't have enough statesmen and stateswomen. We need to find bipartisan solutions to the problems that are facing us today. We have, in fact, I sort of refer to what the parties in Washington, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as the incumbency party, because they're all united in wanting to be reelected. And that tends to take, that's their first priority. And sometimes you got to make hard decisions. It may make you unpopular in the short term, but it's got to be done if we're going to remain a major power in the world. The overextended international commitments, the budget this year for defense is $515 billion. That does not include what the Secretary of Defense Gates says will be $136 billion, which will be allocated for Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. now accounts for half of global defense spending. 1/2. So here's a nation with 4.5% of the world's population, a nation which is the most indebted in the world in nominal dollars. We're spending half of what the entire world spends on defense. Now, can't they become more involved in burden sharing? If they think that our cause is just in Afghanistan or whatever, that they'll pay their fair share, something that we're going to have to look at. The other thing in terms of our forward defense or forward deterrence strategy is that we have basically made pledges to about 30 nations in the world that if they're ever attacked, we will consider that attack as equivalent to an attack on the United States itself. So we are honor bound to come to the aid of a lot of nations. For example, President Bush said that we should extend NATO membership, that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to both Georgia and to Ukraine. They both border Russia. They were both part of the former Soviet Union. And it would mean that if there were any attack coming from Russia on Georgia, for example, which recently occurred, we would be honor bound to come to the aid of Georgia. Now, will we be able to do that? You know, how far will our commitments go? Are we becoming overextended in some of our commitments? These are hard questions that we're going to have to deal with as time goes on. The plight of the average American. Let me say what's going on now. Most of the wealth of American households is attributable to three sources. First of all, our jobs. Secondly, the equity in our homes. And third, our retirement accounts. And they're all under siege right now. Our unemployment rate went up to 7.2% in December. It's highest in 16 years. If you look at unemployment rate, which means those that are too discouraged to look for jobs, or those who are working part-time but want full-time jobs, in December we went up to 13.5%. I can assure you it's going to get worse before it gets better. These figures are going to get worse before they get better. And so a lot of Americans are worried now about their job security. In BYU, we now have a freeze, a new hiring, a faculty. This is happening in various parts of the country. Even Harvard has gone to a freeze for most of its hiring. So people are worried about their jobs, and that's the principal source of wealth. In terms of home equities, they plummeted almost 20% in 2008. In some areas, even more than that. In Southern California, over 30%. 10% of homeowners are delinquent in their payments or already in foreclosure. At least 20% are underwater. That means that they owe more on their mortgages than their homes are worth. They're underwater. This is a tremendous challenge facing the country. And in terms of retirement savings, most of those are linked to the stock market. And in 2008, the S&P 500, which is the broadest measure, went down 37%. It's gone down more over the first few weeks of January. So if you think about your parents supporting you for being here at BYU, and they want you to be here. They want you to be here. But maybe when you phone home, you might say, hey, I'm being frugal. I'm not being extravagant, because they are taking a hit. They're taking a hit now. And they're feeling it psychologically. They're feeling poor. And in fact, they are poor. Now, hopefully there'll be a rebound. But just remember that in terms of your own families, that it's in terms of wealth, they're now feeling the negative wealth effect. That's why they're not going out and spending as much, because they're feeling poor. And that's going to be with us for a time. And this current recession, I believe, will be the longest since the Great Depression. We're not going to be in the same league as the Great Depression of the 30s, but in terms of longevity, it will be the longest since the Great Depression. Now, what about the future? I think that the current problems facing the U.S. are much more numerous and serious than most Americans realize. We can't be complacent about it. The current recession, I believe, is the worst ever experienced by most of you and by most Americans. The American economy, however, I do believe will continue to grow through most of the next 30 years. We will get through this crisis. And if you look at what happens once we begin to rebound, we're going to have much longer stretches of growth than we will have of contraction. That is positive. All right? But I do believe that the U.S. share of global GDP, U.S. share of investment, international investment, the U.S. share of international trade, the dollar being used as the reserve currency for most central banks around the world, the dollar being used as the currency of choice for international trade activity, I think in all those dimensions it will diminish in importance. The dollar will diminish somewhat, as well as our share of the economic pie will diminish. Optimally, as I said, the U.S. standard of living will be appreciably better than now. And people in many other parts of the world will also experience greater prosperity. So what I'm saying is that our share of the pie will be smaller in 2040, but the pie will be much larger. And that hopefully you will have a better standard of living than we now have today. That's what I'm hoping. So it's not a message of gloom. Our standard of living should improve. But as a superpower, we will be in relative decline as we move towards 2040. Now, you as young Americans must prepare for a world where technological change and information creation will be much more rapid than at any other time in human history. A study done at the UC Berkeley Information Management Systems found in the year 2003 that we created information that year that was equivalent to 30 feet of books for every person on the earth. That we're doubling our information base every 5 years or so. Amazing new information coming on board that we're going to have to digest and adapt to. Amazing, something that we've never seen in the lifetimes of older people such as myself. You got to be prepared for creative destruction, as we talked about. It will be a force throughout your lives. You got to be adaptable. You have to be prepared to change jobs several times during your working careers. It used to be, thinking about after World War II, the notion was you can find a job with GM or Ford or Chrysler and you'll do that for your working lifetime. We don't have that now. Maybe if you work for government or you go into the military. But in the private sector, that just isn't going to be there. That lifetime employment. You're going to have to be adaptable there. And you're going to have to relearn and you're going to have to retool from time to time because all of this information bombarding you will be engaged indeed in lifelong learning. I don't see any alternative to that. So the gospel and your family will have to be your anchor because things are going to change so rapidly and your source of stability in a very rapidly changing both national and international environment. Prepare for very exciting times. I think you should be optimistic. Sure, we've got to solve problems. There's no doubt about that, but these are going to be exciting times. And that although military prowess will be important, America's long-term strength and influence abroad will largely be predicated on our ability to get our own house in order, which is not in order right now, and to exemplify the best features of democracy and capitalism and integrity and gospel-inspired human compassion. That will be how we will radiate out to the rest of the world. It will be how we live and the things that we exemplify that will really provide us with the greatest influence. Some people call this soft power. Some people call it smart power as we mix hard power like military and economic might with our influence in other areas. So this is going to be extremely important. And remember the words of George Bernard Shaw. Some look at things that are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. This is something that we'll need you to do. Is to actually, get into the notion, how can we change things for the better? Read President Hinckley's book, Standing for Something. 10 Neglected Virtues That Will Heal Our Hearts and Homes. It will be a great guide for you. It will help you as you go through these turbulent times. And be part of an active and informed and engaged citizen. We have our own building right off Pennsylvania Avenue. Takes you 10 minutes to walk to the White House from that building. And you'll be able to intern there for a semester. You'll get almost full credit, as if you were here. The rent is equal to or even less than you'll pay here in Provo. And it is an experience which is really not replicable on the BYU campus. Do that. Or go to the Utah Legislative Internship. You can just commute to it, up to Salt Lake. Participate in one of our study abroad programs. We have permanent facilities in like London and Jerusalem. And we have programs throughout the world that will really make you grow and allow you to basically look at life in other countries and say, we can learn this from these people just like they can learn this from Americans. Take part in international internships. But take a semester and do this. It will change your lives. It will change your perspective so much if you will be engaged. And then we need you as leaders, whether you're leaders in your family, you're raising children, in the community, at the state level, at the national level. Up until Gordon Smith lost in Oregon, we had 5 active Latter-day Saints as senators in the United States Senate. 5 out of 100. And we need more and more of you going into the Beltway and being willing to take leadership positions. You're desperately needed in all facets of life. And if you will do that, then I'm optimistic about your own personal futures. And also what you will do will help us to be better off as a country. So yes, the United States may well be a superpower in decline relatively. But that does not mean that our standard of living will not increase. And it will not mean that we will refrain from being a major force for good around the world. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, about 3 or 4 minutes, so let me take any questions that you might have in a short time. Yes, sir.
You haven't addressed what I think is a major factor in the world today, and that's the decline of morality.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we definitely could go into that, and certainly this was something that President Hinckley touched on, and of course President Monson is also touching on it. Indeed, one thing that worries me in our own country, I think that there has been a growth in corruption. And as I mentioned, I think that there's legalized and illegal corruption. In terms of what goes on in our tax code and the special favors that are given to special interests, I think that's legalized corruption. There is also the illegal type, as we've seen. And as we look at, it's not just at the national level, but we see it in states. We've seen the problems in New York State recently, in the state of Illinois, and others as well. And maybe life has become a little too coarse. In fact, it has become too coarse for many Americans, and we need to indeed address that issue. And part of that is by our example, but also what we do, in terms of saying there's a better way of doing things, and we can be virtuous, and we could uphold integrity, and not cut corners. And so I agree with you wholeheartedly that that's an area that is at the foundation of the problems that we're facing. Yes, sir.
You've talked a lot about impacts on maybe our way of life as declining as a superpower. What impacts do you see as far as on other countries like global stability, unipolars?
Right, that's a very good question. Some people argue, hey, it's good that the United States will be declining in power. In fact, there's a German Marshall Fund study that came out this past year asking Europeans, is it a good thing that the U.S. be the leading power internationally? And I think only 36% said yes. But if we do decline relatively in power, it means they're going to have to be there to pick up some of the slack. We've been carrying much of the burden. And as a superpower, we've been a relatively benign superpower. Some people criticize this, but we've been relatively benign. Just think if Germany had been the first to develop that heavy water potential and got the atomic bomb before we did, and combined that with their missile technology. Wow, it would have been a different world. Thank goodness it was the United States that got that. And so I think that it will lead to more instability. There will be decisions which will not be as clear-cut. There will be things that will occur that we will regret that the action was not taken. But it means that the rest of the world is going to have to step up and bear the burden. If we're going to continue to be in Afghanistan, others are going to have to step in and say it's worth being in Afghanistan. This cannot be a unilateral action on the U.S. because many of the nations that are now there will begin to withdraw their troops over the next couple of years at a time when President Obama says we're going to add 20 to 30,000 new troops. We will be doing in Afghanistan, if that's the way it's going to be, what happened in Iraq. And Iraq was mostly a unilateral war, where we accounted for well over 80% of the troops, took over 90% of the fatalities, and paid over 90% of the bills. That in essence, the rest of the world is going to have to step up, particularly the Western world, and say we're willing to bear more of the burden. And it's going to lead to more uncertainty and more instability in moving towards that transition. We, of course, we can't withdraw. We should be engaged actively internationally, but we've got to begin to take care of problems at home. And if we can take care of the problems at home, that will project our power base abroad much better than we now are, where we're going deeper and deeper and deeper into debt and still trying to maintain the role of a superpower and spending half of what the entire world spends on defense. So you're absolutely right. There's going to be a period of indecisiveness and uncertainty, and others are going to have to step forward and help us more than they have in the past. Maybe, how are we doing time-wise? One more question. Yes, sir.
What would be the one factor that's triggered this decline? Can you identify one?
Now, I can't identify one. I think it's a series of things. I think it's basically the notion that we can do business as usual and we're still going to prevail. We're still going to do very well. And it's just a combination of factors, particularly as I mentioned in terms of what's happening at home, problems that we have not faced up to, that now have become crises, combined with this movement towards globalization, where things, we just can't make decisions unilaterally. We have to work with other countries. So I think it really is a combination of those three forces that I mentioned, and those forces will continue to be with us for the foreseeable future. Again, thanks for coming. Appreciate it, and good luck in your studies.